Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Tuesday, March 3rd, and today Venus is squaring Saturn. Now, Venus is in the sign of Aries, squaring Saturn in the sign of Capricorn, so that's what we're going to take a look at today. It's perfecting right now. You might have been feeling the effects of this building since late last week, and you may feel the effects of this transit for the next couple of days, though things will change swiftly as Venus is also about to enter Taurus, where she picks up a whole bunch of dignity, gets into her own sign out of her detriment or exile, and then immediately goes into a conjunction with Uranus. Now, we're going to look at all of that movement into Taurus with Uranus a little later in the week. Today, we're just going to talk about Venus and Aries square Saturn and Capricorn. Now, first, let me show you this on the screen and give you just a feel for what you're looking at. So, here we go. First of all, here's Venus in the sign of Aries. Late degrees of Aries, which means it's in those critical anaretic degrees. All of the late degrees of every sign, traditionally speaking, were ruled by Saturn or Mars, the malefics. And so they take on a little bit more of a difficult flavor. Sometimes they're called anaretic degrees, which also means killing. Sometimes people call it killing degrees, not a pleasant phrase. But those late degrees can be a little difficult as a planet is culminating. Both Saturn and Venus are culminating, both about to change signs. Saturn will change signs later this month on the 22nd. Venus is going to change signs just in the next couple of days here into Taurus. But as that's happening, Venus is square to Saturn right there. So there you can see it. This is what we're going to take a look at today from a bunch of different angles, give you a lot of different things to consider. And this planetary combination, of course, that I'm going to discuss today, you could apply to your natal chart if you have Venus and Saturn in any kind of hard aspect, whether it's a square or an opposition or even a conjunction. You may see the blending of the archetypal qualities that we're going to discuss today. So that's what we're looking at, and you'll see this really perfecting today. You might have felt it yesterday, the past couple of days, and again, you might feel it for a few days to come as the separation period usually takes about 3 to 4 degrees. Translate that into 2 to 3 days with Venus's speed. All right, so let's discuss this planetary aspect and what you can expect from it. So remember, let's just briefly review the significations of Venus and Saturn. Venus is the goddess of love, friendship, harmony, beauty, desire, sensuality and the 5 senses, women, friendships, agreements, sexuality. So these are just a few of the things that Venus rules. And then we associate Saturn with winter, death, decay, longevity, old age, hardship, disease, death, darkness, ignorance. But also we associate Saturn with discipline, commitment, perseverance, the wisdom of time and commitment. We also understand that spiritual life can't exist without Saturn, because Saturn is the planet of impermanence, and spiritual life really begins when we look at the material world and go, I'm not my body because it's going to die someday, and everything around me in the material world isn't really going to satisfy me because it's transient. So where is real happiness? That's a Saturnine realization, and when paired with proactive steps that can open up our hearts and put us on a spiritual path, Saturn is an absolutely vital part of our spiritual awakening, you might say, or its symbolism is. So when we put these two planets together, a couple of things that we can say about the two planets. So they're culminating right now at the end of a sign. So there's a little bit more of a feeling of critical mass. These realizations are, you could say, cumulative. They have a history behind them. There's a weightiness behind them. Venus is, of course, in Aries, which is the fall of Saturn. And so there is, and Saturn yet is overcoming Venus from the superior position in Capricorn. So this is not exactly the easiest square. Squares, we know, are of the nature of Mars. So they have a little bit more conflict and tension between the two of them right now. And yet there are always ways in which, even though Saturn might be dominating Venus a little bit, Venus isn't so fond of what Saturn is exerting, the power or force that Saturn is exerting. This square can still yield some really positive results, and probably some really innovative breakthroughs that are on the way, because both planets are about to change signs. And we're going to see Saturn starting to get into a square with Uranus, which has a lot to do with breaking down structures and outworn habits while reinforcing positive new ones. And Venus, just in the next couple of days, is going to eclipse Uranus, where there is need for creative revolution. So what feels like kind of a hard Saturn-Venus dynamic right now should turn positive very quickly, or should lead to some breakthroughs really quickly. So let's talk about what you can expect now thematically. So when you put the two together, here's some of the themes. I have a whole bunch written down, but so how about, first of all, responsibility, a Saturnine thing, and commitment, a Saturnine thing in relationships, Venus. Now that could be from business partnerships or arrangements to romantic relationships, setting boundaries, defining expectations, setting parameters. These are all the types of things that you could see right now with Venus square Saturn. Then other thing that can come along with this are vows. In Sanskrit, the word vrata is, if I have that right, is loosely equivalent to the word vow. And one of the things that I just want to say, kind of take a philosophical tangent here for a moment and just say that Venus Saturn is great for making vows. And what is a vow and how can it help us? Well, you know, in our culture, in our world, in some ways, vows are really looked down upon because we have such an individualistic, such an emphasis on the individual, the rights, needs, power, sovereignty, journey of the individual. And of course, some of that is really positive and some of that can be really negative. For example, we have a huge divorce rate in our culture. Now, part of that is, you know, I'm not going to go on a rant here saying that everyone should keep their vows and stay married forever. That would be really puritanical. But what I am going to say is that maybe just proposing this idea, you know, maybe part of the reason that we have such a culture of divorce is also because we don't like the part about duty, responsibility, commitment, and the long suffering of love. Venus Saturn speaks to the long suffering of love, that love over a long period of time, whether it's love for a musical instrument or love for a language or a subject that you study or a job that you have or a family member or anything in life, requires not just that we enjoy the relationship, but that we suffer along with the relationship. To suffer, you know, is a choice that we make in good faith when we take a vow, that the suffering of this vow is building something in me spiritually that I believe to be valuable. So taking a vow is, in a sense, taking a vow to do something and see it through, see the intention, see the commitment through a lot of ups and downs. Sometimes in our culture, not all the time, obviously, but sometimes in our culture, we are averse to the downs. We're averse to the hardships. We're averse to the suffering that comes along with developing something over a long period of time. And so sometimes I've seen thousands of people in my practice, and I observe that many times people have very good reasons for getting out of relationships, getting out of jobs, all sorts of things that people sort of give up on. They say, you know what, it's reached its expiration date. Venus Saturn can also resemble the expiration date on something, just like Venus Pluto can. Venus Saturn is a bit more like, you know what, the writing's on the wall. I can see it. It's clear. Done. Relationship is over. Separation, Saturn in relationship, Venus. But also, there is the sense in which, because it's uncomfortable, because it's painful, we think to myself, I better cash out right now and go put my money and energy and time and, you know, intentions into something that will be more instantly gratifying. Venus Saturn is not a planetary combination of instant gratification. It's a planetary combination that suggests that we learn something about the pleasure of suffering. I don't mean to be sadistic or masochistic, but there is a pleasure in suffering. You know, if you ever heard that song, I think it was by Bryan Adams, The Summer of '69. In the beginning of that song, I'll never forget when I was first learning to play guitar, not that I'm any kind of guitar virtuoso, something that has been a hobby for me over the course of, you know, many years since I was a teenager. There's the beginning of the song, The Summer of '69. He says something like, I got my first real six string. I played it till my fingers bled. So that bleeding, right? I remember when I was a kid, you know, and playing guitar and my fingers were bleeding and I had to build the calluses and everything like that. I remember hearing that song and being so inspired by it, you know, because at the time what I was understanding was that you have to put some blood, sweat, and tears, another name of a great band, by the way, but blood, sweat, and tears into something that you love. This is why, you know, we see great saints like Jesus, even living modern saints, you could say, like Nelson Mandela, people who, were imprisoned or tortured or suffered, the passion of the Christ, we call it. That's in a certain respect, that's Venus Saturn, the long suffering of something that we believe leads to a beauty that is so rare because of the stubborn persistence with which we cling to an intention, that breeds a kind of beauty that you can't find anywhere else. So just to push back a little bit in the culture of let me change it up as soon as it gets uncomfortable, maybe we would have longer lasting commitments and a deeper, more robust beauty in our life if we learn to suffer along with things and learn to have a deeper taste, patience, and listening heart for the painful seasons in our life that come along with our commitments, whether it's parenting or jobs or learning something or romance, whatever. Now, that's a message brought to you by Venus Saturn. I expect that, people will feel some pushback to that, and you should, because that's not the only way of looking at things. But it is the Venus Saturn way of looking at things, so I wanted to bring it up. So remember that most spiritual bliss, happiness that we are looking for, that exists within the self, within the soul, and in relationship to our divine source, is cultivated through a certain degree of austerity, a certain degree of tapasya, sacrifice. And in ancient astrology, in the ancient world, divination itself couldn't be performed without some degree of sacrifice. And so just remember that right now, because if there is an area of your life where you're looking and you're going, there could be more pleasure here. I'm bored, or I'm frustrated, or I'm restless. Sometimes things need rearranging, and other times there may be a call to, sort of relook at your commitments and double down on them. And, for example, it's a great time to make a vow to do something to create a cleaner, healthier way of living. Venus represents cleanliness, and Saturn, of course, is the commitment or the perseverance over time. It's a great time, for example, to just shift something in your everyday diet or lifestyle to create a more sattvic environment. Sattva being the mode of goodness, just to create a cleaner, more open, simple, pure space around you. You might be feeling unhappy, and you might look and say, here's something I can do. I can commit to. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a little bit hard. I might have to pour some of my blood, sweat, and tears into it, but I know that in time it will lead to a cleaner, fresher environment. And I trust, like medicine, when you take even something like ibuprofen, it's like you have a headache. It's not going to work right away. You got to trust that in like 20 to 30 minutes, the medicine will take hold. Well, similarly, when we make a vow, we're not making a vow because we think that as soon as we make the vow, somehow then the fruits of that commitment will just appear. So similarly, if you make a vow right now to try and improve something or generate more happiness because you're feeling a lack of happiness, you may see the results that you're looking for, but it may take time. So anyway, and of course, I would argue there's no better vow to take than, cultivating a spiritual lifestyle. I'm going to close my window because I'm getting a lot of light on my face. There we go. I think you can probably see my face a little bit better. I don't know if you could see that, and I had a lot of light coming in. So now relationships can also go through testing periods with Venus and Saturn, where it feels like there are major tests, and the degree to which we pass or fail them, or we have to judge the results of these tests in our relationships. You have to be careful that you're not being an overly harsh judge. Venus Saturn can also lead to a hypersensitivity to the smallest little tarnishes or the smallest little imperfections. That's sort of the potential for a little obsessiveness with Venus Saturn in that regard. Now, you're thinking about all kinds of agreements, working relationships, or contracts that can be solidified. Those are other things that can happen with Venus and Saturn, along with testing in relationships. You can think of the cooling off period that comes sometimes when two people are separated and need to cool off and reflect and have distance and objectivity in order to see one another more clearly. Distance and absence make the heart grow fonder, and that can be a really good thing. Venus and Saturn, for example, were square as the weekend was passing over this past weekend, and my wife was out of town at an herbal conference, and I was solo parenting at home, and it was so difficult, first of all, to replicate everything that my wife does, in addition to like having to work. And I was just amazed, and it deepened my appreciation for her and for what she does. And so sharing that with her, when she got home, of course, that really meant a lot to her. So that can be a thing where Venus Saturn can mean separation, ending or separating from a commitment or an agreement, or it can be the space or the distance that allows people to kind of, I don't know, just gain that perspective that you don't always have. It can also represent a period where the degree of attraction or interest that you had in someone or something is starting to cool off, where you're getting this dose of realism and being like, oh, maybe it's not what I thought it was. So that can happen as well. There can be definitely themes of loneliness, fear of commitment, lack of affection, lack of intimacy. Saturn can be kind of hard, cold, and dry and withholding or removing or isolating. And Venus, of course, prefers sensual contact. There can also be like mutual objectification going on, like I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. So you do have to be careful about that. Saturn can be a little bit cold and ruthless, and Venus, if Venus wants something and gets into it with Saturn, can say, look, you want this, I want that. We both don't really like each other or care for each other, but let's just have a mutual agreement about this. Okay, so you think, for example, about, that classic image of someone, trying to sleep with the right person or hook up with the right person in order to get something. That kind of Venus Saturn, where someone's like, yeah, I'll give you this because you're giving me that, and it's not necessarily good. So you have to be careful of those kinds of dynamics. Also, you can look at business partners, for example, that, have to set boundaries with one another, specifically because they're married. For example, my wife and I owned a yoga studio with each other, and there was lots of periods where we had to figure out how to kind of separate our work dynamic from, our relationship and home dynamic, because they're two different spheres. But sometimes it has to do with like just different kinds of boundaries that exist within romantic relationships, sometimes in work at the same time. It can also have something to do with conflicts or even scandals in the workplace regarding sex or harassment, things like that. It can be about the serious, hardworking woman or the hardworking feminine, and sometimes also that stereotype like, oh, she's cold, hard, and ruthless, which sometimes hardworking, successful women get, as though, no man who gets that is usually talked about like that, not necessarily just because they're productive, but you might have a sort of double standard where it's like, oh, you're successful and really committed to what you do when you're a woman. Oh, well, that means, you're ruthless. So Venus Saturn can also be about some of those double standards around women in the workplace, or women and commitment and hard work to their craft or to whatever they do. So you have to be careful of that. Love and work. I love my work. My work is what I love. So Venus Saturn can be, sometimes people are like, oh, you're a workaholic, or you work all the time, don't you do anything for fun? And there's definitely a culture, like a sort of part of the self-help culture, that's like, don't work too much, do self-care. It's also true that some people's deepest passion and love is something that they do. They play an instrument, they have a company, whatever the case might be, and they love the suffering of it. So we have to be very careful that we're not, Venus Saturn is the, it's like I just took my daughter over the weekend while my wife was gone to see The Call of the Wild, and she really loved this movie. She sat on my lap, and otherwise loves any kind of movie with dogs in it. But so we saw Call of the Wild, and she was sitting on my lap, and she had a lot of questions afterwards about the movie or whatever. But one of the things that she asked me in the car on the way home was, she said, do the dogs like pulling the sleds? It's like, oh, that's a complicated question. Because in the movie, of course, they were, dog sledding in Alaska. And I said, well, there are some dogs who really like to do work. They're very happy when they're productive and doing work. They like to pull things. And it's known, for example, with some dog breeds, when you if you buy certain dog breeds, that you should really give them a lot of physical exercise and like hard labor. And some dogs were bred for that, and so it's sort of in them or whatever. Now, you could go on and on about, whether or not dogs should really carry loads or not. That's not the point. The simple point was that there is a sense in which all of us as living beings love work. We love having something that's productive. You love running. You get to that point when you're running and you have the breakthrough and you're like, this hurts, but in a good way, because you've hit that breakthrough moment in your workout. So similarly, like I was just explaining to Gigi that, sometimes it could be really mean to give, put things on dogs' backs and make them carry them. And that could be really mean. But sometimes dogs really need exercise and they really love it. They love pulling things or being active or doing work. And, so at any rate, that's a good way of thinking about Venus Saturn, the love that we have for working on something. How about the idea that something isn't beautiful unless it's substantive, has integrity and realism mixed in? That's a Venus Saturn ideal. Seeing something for what it is, not for what we wish it would be. For example, I see people, every day of the week, and one of the most common things that comes up is, let's say, for example, that someone has a weight issue and they're struggling to maintain their weight or cut down weight, or they have maybe some problems with emotional eating or something like that. One of the things that I've noticed over time is that people will generally, when they share it in a session, first of all, it takes a lot of vulnerability and courage to share something like that. But then once we do share it, if we share it with anyone, all of us are prone to then immediately leap to an excuse or a justification that one might sympathize with or understand. Why do we do this? It's not just because, we're lazy. It's not because nothing happened to us at all. So somewhere in between those two things is the truth. And what I try to do in my practice, which I've had some spiritual teachers help me to do, and I've worked with a Jungian therapist for a long time. My own Jungian therapist takes this approach at times as well, which is to just sit with the plain truth of something. For example, let's say if someone has a tendency to overeat, to just sit and say, I overeat, and just kind of own it, not own it in any kind of possessive, powerful sense, just kind of letting it be, I guess is a better way of putting it. This is what it is. Now, of course, it could be that part of the way you were raised, part of the food that you were fed, part of the traumas that you've endured, part of your, who knows, past lifetimes have led to this pattern. And there's been some really hard, difficult things that have happened to you or me or whoever it might be that we can empathize with. And there's a place for all of that. But sometimes we think that in order for people to really love and accept me, which is a Venus concern, Venus ranges anything from the desire for love and harmony to the desire for popularity or acceptance. And when we look at Saturn, we think of Saturn as the exclusionary force. Saturn is the lord of the opposition in astrology. And Saturn can be about who's in and who's out, who's on the inside of the wall and who's on the outside of the wall, the barrier or boundary between what is accepted and what is rejected. Saturn is the boundary between what is visible and what is invisible. So he's like a gatekeeper. So Venus Saturn can be an acute awareness of whether or not we're accepted that can cause us at times, to really try to justify our hurts, our wounds, our problems in ways that we think other people can understand. But Saturn Venus can also be the strength or courage to just look ourselves in the mirror, not with any kind of hyper boot camp responsibility complex, but with simple responsibility, with integrity, with simple presence, allowing something to be no more and no less than what it is. Not some great blemish that needs to be fixed, because that's ego, and not nothing because I'm fine, I'm perfect just the way I am, which also might be a lie, but just what it is. Like, okay, I overeat, or I have maybe I have a temper, or maybe it's, I struggle to remain committed in my relationships. I struggle to follow through. I struggle to, take care of myself, or I struggle to, not watch as much TV. I know I shouldn't be watching as much. I should be doing something that I really want to be doing, but I keep doing this. When we just kind of sit there and allow the fault or the flaw to be what it is, to just really be what it is, not to be like, okay, and I'm going to take responsibility for it, not to pass off blame or responsibility to someone or something else in the past or whatever. Just be with it. The beauty that is inherent within us, the appreciating capacity that we each have, will grow. And one of the simplest ways of starting to change something in our lives is starting by appreciating. So if we can just appreciate what is, whatever it is, just by saying, okay, this is what I'm dealing with, and I appreciate it. Appreciate the situation that I'm in. And by doing that, appreciating capacity, developing our appreciating capacity, we start to be able to find the happiness that we're looking for, not so much in what we have or don't have, what we are or are not, but in the constant process that we're in as beings that are inherently beautiful. How can we be inherently beautiful if we're always working to be it? You know what I mean? So it starts, in a sense, Venus Saturn, by developing the appreciating capacity. And there's no better place to develop the appreciating capacity than sitting with what something is when it is difficult or hard. Because it's easy to appreciate when something's great, but to truly develop appreciating capacity, we need to be able to appreciate in some ways in an equally sober, deep, thoughtful fashion, whether something is up or something is down. So to appreciate what is, to not make excuses, to not take some kind of hypervigilant responsibility to conquer it, just to be with it, to appreciate it. That's a Venus-Saturn dynamic. So at any rate, let's go on. Enduring love. So that's another theme or quality. Quality time. Some people, we forget to have quality time with anything. We have a checklist, we get everything done, but we haven't done any of the things on our list with quality of consciousness. Venus Saturn is also about, where do we find that beauty that's persevering, that's long enduring? Through the quality of our consciousness that we bring into our relationship with something, not just the goal or the work at the end. So the other thing is that we can understand if we want to, right now is a really good time to look at something. Let's say there's something we're looking at, we go, wow, it's really ugly. Something in a relationship, something in ourselves, and we just go, wow, I'm not happy with this. I'm not pleased with this. This is ugly or distasteful, or this is blemished or flawed. Venus-Saturn dynamic. Remember that there's an amazing ability with Venus-Saturn to understand the nature of the seed from the fruit. So Venus-Saturn might be, for example, that, you've got it's that we talked about this with Venus-Pluto, but you've got that smell coming from the refrigerator in the morning, and you're like, oh my God, something went bad in the refrigerator. And then what you do is you take that thing out, you throw it away or whatever. But then if you reflect on where did that come from? Well, it's very simply, it came from something reaching its expiration date, but where did that come from? How did I let this happen? So through that smell, through that ugly smell in the refrigerator, you go back and you see the invisible roots. Oh, I got busy with this, this, and this. And I forgot to keep up with this other thing. So if we look at the fruit blossoming in our life, sometimes Venus-Saturn will show us the invisible seed. One of my favorite verses in the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Purana, talks about the way that this, if you go searching for the source of something, right? Like, speaking of source, like how about our divine original source? If you go searching for it in a tangible way, if you try to seek it out in a way that's, just super concrete, oftentimes you don't find anything. You can't find anything. People get frustrated by that, spiritually speaking. But there's this great verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam that says that, just like when a seed takes root and the plant starts growing, the original seed disappears. The original seed is no longer there. But for people who are wise, who know how plants grow, that even when you're looking at the flower, you know that that came from the seed, even though no matter how deep down you dig into the soil, you're not going to find that seed that's there anymore. So there's a way in this world in which if we want to grow spiritually, we have to learn how to understand the subtle causes of things, the subtle causes in all areas of life that lead to the fruits that we either find deeply meaningful to the soul, or that we find, that cause us to continue to live in ignorance or illusion or darkness. So we look at the fruits in our life and we can intuit the subtle seeds of what kinds of actions led to better qualitative states of happiness. And of course, when we reflect upon that deeply enough over a long enough period of time, what we find is that the seed and source of everything that has ever brought us any happiness is, of course, God. And of course, the relationship then to our source that lives within us, that is part and parcel of our own soul, our higher self, that we start prioritizing getting back to a relationship with our cultivation of that soul and relationship with that source. That's the actual seed that bears all of the good fruit in any regard. And so, and of course, if we want to be really daring, we can also look at the difficult things in our life and not just go down to the seed of some problematic decision we made, but also look at the outcomes as teachings and as lessons. Where is this coming from? And we can see that the lesson that we've learned might be related to, in some ways, a bad or misinformed choice of some kind. But we can also see that there is intelligence from root to fruit, from seed and source up to blossom, that there's intelligence there. And hence, again, even in difficult times, we can see that the original seed of everything is divinity. So Venus Saturn is also the ability to look beyond superficial appearances to the root and source of something. The superficial appearance is going to be Venus with Saturn, where Venus says, oh, look at me, I'm spectacular, or I'm this, or I'm that. And Saturn says, yeah, but that's really transient and impermanent. Where does all of this come from? And that's what we want to cultivate the relationship with, because the superficial appearance is really transient. And then it turns out that when we do cultivate a relationship with that divine source within us, that we start seeing beauty in all things, even when something flowers in our life and it's really difficult or heavy. We get a sense of the subtle cause, so we can maybe correct something, but we also still see that divine authorship in all things. And that's so blissful. We have to move beyond transient appearances and go much deeper into that invisible source. Saturn Venus is like that as well, because Saturn points to the transcendental, and it is the gateway between the visible and the invisible. So Venus Saturn is about beauty that is real, not just, and the root cause of something, the root subtle cause of something that goes beyond the temporary appearance. So that's something else to think about. All right. So anyway, that's another little kind of spiritual talking point today. You've got enjoyment of alone time. Sometimes you just need alone time. You also have age, time, and pleasure, and how pleasure changes with age. And I think about how much I like to be on the go and how fast I like to move when I was younger. And the truth is also that our relationship with pleasure changes over time. Venus Saturn can also be about the natural attraction to people or things that are older. Like whether it's like an art museum, or if it's something from the past that we find an ancient, attractive piece of art. I thought this was really interesting today on my newsfeed. One of my colleagues shared that there was a 2,000-year-old dagger that was found in like a sheath from the Roman Empire. So here's this beautiful, it was really beautiful looking dagger. So there's Venus in God of War, Aries, God of War, Mars is sign of Aries, square Saturn, an ancient piece of martial artwork. It was very specific, but kind of cool to see. And you'll see stuff like that popping up when, in the collective too. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so routine, boredom, and duty outweighing pleasure. So you have to be careful of that. Sometimes there's going to be a call to be like, look, like if you're bored, are you doing anything that brings you joy and happiness, or are you just checking things off a list? An acute awareness of what is popular, what is liked or not liked, melancholy, an unrealistic need for attention. I picked a few of these up from this book, by the way. There's a few really good things that you can get in almost every page of this book about planetary combinations, the archetypal universe from Ren Butler. Really nice archetypal cookbook. Where was I? Yeah. Let's say melancholy, an unrealistic need for attention, excessive sensitivity to small blemishes. Some of these are from Ren's book. Unwanted attractions. Like have you ever had the the creepy old person on the bus, like looking you up and down? That could be Saturn with Venus. Boredom in love and intimacy, that's another thing. Also long practice of something artistic or something something like someone who's gaining a medal or an award for a magnum opus creatively. That's kind of a Venus Saturn thing. Imaginative or aesthetic blocks, you're feeling blocked creatively. That can be a Venus Saturn dynamic. The attraction that people have to darkness as erotic or sensual, that can be a Venus Saturn dynamic. For example, people who love, Depeche Mode and a little, you know what I mean? Just a little dark and depressive and melancholic, but somehow that's sort of sexy. It's like maybe a little emo Venus. Venus. Or you could also think of Kurt Cobain. He had a Venus Saturn conjunction in his chart. Haunted beauty. So that's one to think about. And then the other one that's hard is beauty and age. And, we live in a culture where everyone wants beauty to last forever. And the other thing that Venus Saturn speaks to is the maturity that is required to see age as beautiful in and of itself, that we grow more beautiful as we age in a certain sense, that we can appreciate the beauty of old age or of aging, rather than constantly trying to correct or eliminate or hide blemishes that we feel like comes with aging. Those are all Venus Saturn dynamics. So anyway, I hope I provided you with some good things to think about for this Venus Saturn dynamic. A few philosophical sojourns. I hope you enjoyed those. One of the things that happened for me recently that was really helpful was I made a vow. I always do try to make a vow yearly, or a couple of vows yearly, both prohibitions and things that I'm proactive about. So for example, a proactive vow that I took a couple of years ago was to, it was 2017 now, it was 2017, was to get up at sunrise every morning and start my yoga practice at sunrise every morning for a year. So that was my proactive part of doing something that could grow my spiritual life, practicing my chanting and my yoga every morning. And the prohibition that I went along with it at that time was, for me, was related to midnight snacking, so not eating after dinner, which is not really good for you, yogically speaking. It messes up your digestion while you're sleeping and so forth. So it's a really good time when Venus is square Saturn. What to speak of it almost being, Aries time of year, where you get a good pop of action-oriented energy. Where you can look and you can see the fruits in your life and see what has manifested. And if you meditate on it, you can get to that subtle and almost invisible cause, analyze it, fix it if you need to, make a few vows to change something if the fruit isn't attractive or isn't bringing you real joy and pleasure. At the same time, it's a good time to remember that the way we define pleasure and happiness and beauty in our lives, if it is transient, if it is shallow, that we can do some inner work to make sure that we're looking for a lasting, deep sense of happiness. And to do that, sometimes we have to get down to the source of all things, whether it's a blemish or whether it's the wilting part of the rose or if it's the rose in full blossom. If we can get down to the original source of all of these transient phases of beauty and pleasure and ugliness and displeasure, and really get deeply into them, we find our soul. And that's the meeting ground for all of these cycles, the place where they all, the ground of our being in which they all take place. And if we see reflected in that the source of all beings, then we really have wisdom to start seeing and committing to the long, slow, enduring love of a spiritual life. So I hope that this has been helpful for all of you. Make a few vows if you need to. And I look forward to talking about Venus's interest into Taurus, which is coming up, where Venus will then hit Uranus. And that's a whole different dynamic to talk about, which is going to be really fun. So we'll do that later this week. And I have a few Q&A episodes we're going to do this week as well. I think I'm going to be doing one on the difference between the midheaven and the 10th whole sign house. I have a few other questions that have come in like that too. So stay tuned. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.